Welcome back to this series on Herman Dooyeweerd's Roots of Western Culture. In this video, we're going to look at the second part of Chapter 5, where Dooyeweerd continues his discussion of the Roman Catholic ground motive of nature and grace, and also considers its continuing influence within Protestant Christianity. When we think about how we are to live as Christians here in today's world, we're inclined to pose the problem in terms of the relationship between Christianity and society, or Christianity and the world. And this is a reflection of the influence of the nature-grace motive, because it places Christianity on one side, that of grace, while society or culture or politics or the world is set on the other side, that of nature. And so we think of how society relates to Christianity through the idea of how nature relates to grace. Now, within the Catholic tradition, the Christian character of society is marked by the recognition that natural society has its limits, and where the soul's eternal salvation is concerned, the state must defer to the guidance and authority of the Church. We could consider it like this. We work as Christians so long as our work is honest, that is, it doesn't contradict the moral teachings of Christianity. We should use the money we earn in a good Christian way, giving to church and charity, for example. We may also consider our job as a mission field, where we can speak of God's love and share the gospel to our colleagues. This allows our natural life to be in harmony with and directed towards our Christian life. However, this relationship is essentially an external relationship, and this leads to the view that the institutional church, as Dooyeweerd puts it, embraces all of Christendom and all of Christian life. But this view once again gives evidence of a Christianized Greek conception where society is understood in terms of the whole part schema, and which denies the intrinsic nature of the life spheres as rooted in the divine creation order. Against this view, Dooyeweerd insists that the kingdom of God resides not in a temporal institution, but in the hearts of the redeemed. Dooyeweerd's argument is that the nature-grace ground motive is unable to understand the true significance of the heart as the religious centre of human existence, because it understands human nature to be divided along the lines of the form-matter motive. Instead, for Dooyeweerd, the whole human lives and thinks and breathes. It is the whole person that worships God, that enters a marriage, that participates in political processes. The continuing influence of the form-matter motive breaks up this unity and makes what Dooyeweerd calls the logical function of thought, and takes it out of this coherence and elevates it to an immortal rational soul, which serves as the form of the material body. This also affects our understanding of the radical character of the fall and redemption. A rational soul cannot bring any insight into the true heart or soul of human existence, out of which flows the issues of life, and so cannot fully appreciate Jesus' warning of the evil that proceeds from the heart. Without this radical understanding of the heart, we lose also the radical character of redemption, the need to be born again, to have God's law written on the heart. The nature-grace motive affects the way we think about everything. So for family life, education, social action, or political activity to have a Christian character, it must, Dooyeweerd says, bear the stamp of the Church. To the extent that these function according to the natural level, they are not part of the Church and so not specifically Christian. For example, marriage can be considered according to natural law as the community of husband and wife for the purpose of procreation. But it is also a sacrament and so becomes a matter of canon law in view of its sacramental character. Dooyeweerd now discusses a document distributed during the German occupation of Holland, entitled The Glass House, again a Roman Catholic party, which emphasizes the Catholic Church's position as the only true sovereign authority for a Christian in society. Dooyeweerd's discussion of the Glass House document shows how his concern with the roots of Western culture is not merely a historical interest, but that he moves from the historical context to his contemporary context. And one of the big issues that Dooyeweerd was interested in was the idea and possibility of a Christian philosophy, So he also discusses the influence of nature and grace on the ideas of faith and philosophy. The traditional Thomist rejects the idea of a Christian philosophy because philosophy is considered to be rightly autonomous from revealed theology. The idea is that philosophy must proceed under the natural light of reason alone. Now, Dooyeweerd is careful to distinguish the Thomist notion of autonomy from the humanist. It may have been better, perhaps, to use a different term altogether. The point, though, is that philosophical truth can be known and established independent from divine revelation. The truths established by the great Greek philosopher Aristotle can be readily incorporated into the larger structure of truth set forth by the Roman Catholic Church. Philosophical truth, then, is available to all reasonable people in their natural state. However, it only finds its complete fulfillment when understood as the natural stepping stone to ecclesiastical faith, in other words, pointing towards grace. If it turns out that there are conflicts between natural philosophy and revealed theology, then it will be the task of true philosophy to expose these as errors in thinking. However, by viewing philosophy as something natural, which, while independent, finds its true position as a preparation for theology, it is clear that the religious ground motive of nature and grace is playing a decisive role. This is part of Dooyeweerd's overall argument that philosophy is never independent of a religious ground motive. We've seen how a theme important to Dooyeweerd is that of the antithesis, and any Christian viewpoint will need to give some kind of explanation for that. And the motive of nature, grace, must also give account for the antithesis. And it does so by viewing the antithesis as an opposition between the apostate principle that severs nature from church dogma and the Roman Catholic principle that, under the guidance of ecclesiastical authority, places nature in the service of supernatural perfection. And so nature and grace doesn't ignore the antithesis, but it re-understands it within its own context. Dooyeweerd also links his discussion here to the recent general election of 1946 and the Christopher group of Catholics that joins the Dutch Labour Party. Dooyeweerd holds that it is only the biblical creation, fall, redemption ground motive that is integral. And so although the nature-grace motive is a Christian motive, it is nevertheless dialectical in nature and so unstable because of the way it combines Christian themes with non-Christian themes. And Dooyeweerd writes, wherever it had the opportunity to have an impact, this real religious tension drove life and thought from one pole to the other. This expresses itself, he argues, in two opposed dangers. On the one hand, that the nature motive would overrun the motive of grace by summoning the mysteries of grace before the court of natural reason. On the other hand, there was the constant temptation of mysticism, which attempted to escape sinful nature in a mystical experience of supernatural grace, and thus inevitably led to asceticism and world flight. It was only the authority of the Church that could hold these poles together. One might expect here, in the context of his discussion of the disintegration of the synthesis, a historical argument to support this thesis. However, the next few pages cover William of Ockham as a figure that illustrates this disintegration, but it's also as background to Luther, who in turn is background to Dooyeweerd's contemporary context and the dialectical theology that was popular at the time. This brings out the extent to which, as we've said, the roots of Western culture are still with us. They are our roots, and so contemporary and not merely of antiquarian interest. William of Ockham represents for Dooyeweerd the beginning of the modern period. He mercilessly laid bare the inner dualism of the Roman Catholic ground motive, denying that there was any point of contact between the realm of nature and the realm of grace. He was keenly aware that the Greek view of nature flagrantly contradicted the scriptural motive of creation. Ockham rejected the notion of divine reason as the basis for natural law, as inconsistent with the sovereignty of God. In order to break with the Greek deification of reason, he ended up in another extreme. He interpreted the will of the divine creator as despotic arbitrariness. There was therefore no rational grounding for the moral law. God was not bound to a prior moral order, but gives the moral order in an arbitrary way, such that God could just as easily have commanded the opposite. By separating nature and grace, Ockham rejected the Church's guidance in natural life. Science is not subordinated to Church beliefs, nor are temporal authorities subordinate to the Pope. The weak situation of Pope John XII at the time, who had to flee from Rome, did not help, but the ground was set for a future with two options according to Dooyeweerd. One could either return to the scriptural ground motive of the Christian religion, or in line with the new motive of nature, severed from the faith of the Church, establish a modern view of life concentrated on the religion of human personality. The first led to the Reformation, the second to modern humanism. Dooyeweerd's contemporary concerns come out at the end of this section, where he wants to gain a proper insight into the spiritual situation of contemporary Protestantism, looking at the theme of the Church and the world, the influence of Barthianism, and the resistance to the antithesis as a genuine cultural reality. Ockham's separation between natural life and the Christian life drove a wedge between creation and redemption. In following Ockham, Luther continues the influence of the nature-grace ground motive, but with the emphasis on the separation between the two poles rather than the traditional Catholic interpretation. For Luther, this sharp divide between natural life and supernatural life is expressed in terms of the opposition between law and gospel. In the Catholic expression of nature and grace, creation and redemption were held in balance, but the radical character of the fall fell out of view. Luther returned to the biblical confession of the radical nature of the fall, but because of the continued influence of the nature-grace motive, he was unable to do justice to the meaning of creation. So nature comes to be viewed as sinful nature and is related to the law, which is placed in antithesis to redemption, understood as evangelical grace. While Luther drew on St. Paul for this contrast, Dooyeweerd argues that Luther's view is not the same as Paul's, since Paul always calls God's law holy and good. Dooyeweerd writes that under Ockham's influence, Luther robbed the law itself, as creational ordinance, of its intrinsic value. For him, the law was harsh and rigid, and as such in inner contradiction to the love command of the gospel. This can be seen as the fundamental failure of the evangelical movement, which views Christianity in terms of sin and salvation, and has consistently failed to give robust place to creation in the life and thought of Christianity. By contrasting God's will as the creator with God's will as the redeemer, Luther prevented any notion that this world belongs to God and is in need of being intrinsically reformed by the scriptural ground motive of the Christian religion. Nevertheless, Dooyeweerd expresses appreciation for Luther's idea that every profession rests upon a divine calling, and his break with the Roman Catholic view that monastic life had a higher value than worldly life. However, there still remained in Luther the tension between worldly life as the realm of law and Christian life guided by the gospel of love. This view affected Luther's approach to the Church as institute. Since what mattered in the Church was the word and sacrament, the juridical organization of the Church could be left to secular authorities, and so state churches have been common in Lutheran countries. Also, while Luther spoke against Aristotle and the whole reason, he made no attempt to develop philosophy or education on the basis of the biblical ground motive. This then allowed a return to the synthesis with Greek thought with its body-soul dualism. It also opened the way to create a new synthesis with humanistic thought as it gained power and influence. Dooyeweerd believes that this provides background to the so-called dialectical theology of Karl Barth and his co-workers. Dialectical theology sharply opposes the religious antithesis in the area of worldly life, rejecting the idea of Christian politics or political party, labour organisations, and of Christian scholarship. While this movement was firmly against humanism, pressing the incommensurable claim of God's word against the arrogance of humanism, it could only do this by placing the Christian principle in command of the grace motive, while leaving the nature motive in the hands of modern humanism. They understood nature not in the scholastic Aristotelian sense, but in the modern humanistic sense, writes Dooyeweerd. Many feel that Barth, having absolutely separated nature and grace, mortally wounded the Roman Catholic synthesis. However, Barth had only severed dialectical theology from the Greek and scholastic conception of nature. Where the Roman Catholic Church had taken a positive stance towards the Greek contribution to understanding nature, Barth allowed the creation motive to recede from sight. He rejected any notion of creational ordinances that might serve as guidelines in our natural life. However, Brunner took a different path and saw creation ordinances as valid expressions of common grace. Nevertheless, these still stood in tension with the divine love commandment. For Brunner, the law, the cold, rigid framework in which God confines sinful nature, must really be broken through by the evangelical commandment of love. This commandment knows no general rule and is valid only in and for the moment. Dooyeweerd's main point is that in its religious root, dialectical theology persistently demonstrates the inherent dialectic of the Roman Catholic ground motive, but does so in a modern way. This provides a neat segue into the discussion of the modern humanistic ground motive of nature and freedom that begins in the next chapter.